Loyalists were American colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War. At the time, they were often called Tories, or Royalists, or King's Men. Patriots called them persons inimical to the liberties of America. They were opposed by the Patriots, those who supported the Revolution. When their cause was defeated, about 15% of the Loyalists, or 65,000–70,000, fled to other parts of the British Empire, to Britain or elsewhere in British North America. The southern colonists moved mostly to Florida, which had remained loyal to the Crown, and to British Caribbean possessions, while northern colonists largely migrated to Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, where they were called United Empire Loyalists. Most were compensated with Canadian land or British cash distributed through formal claims procedures. Historians have estimated that between 15 and 20% of the 2.5 million whites in the colonies were Loyalists, or about 500,000 men, women and children. Background: the American Revolution was a civil war based on who would rule in the 13 colonies. Families were often divided as war-forced colonists to choose sides in a conflict that remained for many years uncertain. Colonists, especially recent arrivals, often felt themselves to be both American and British subjects of the king, still owing a loyalty to the mother country. Many, like Maryland lawyer Daniel Dulaney, opposed taxation without representation, but would not break their oath to the king or take up arms against him. In one of his many pamphlets, Dulaney wrote, "There may be a time when redress may not be obtained. Till then, I shall recommend a legal, orderly, and prudent resentment." Most hoped for a peaceful reconciliation, and were forced by the Patriots, who took control nearly everywhere in 1775–76, to choose sides. Likely the earliest formal meeting, and use of the term «Loyalist», and the source of the United Empire Loyalist acronym, took place in Boston on October 28, 1775. At the meeting, held at the suggestion of General Thomas Gage, these Loyalists formed a society called the Loyalist Associates, desiring the unity of the empire. Motivations of Loyalism. Yale historian Leonard Woods Larrabee has identified 8 characteristics of the Loyalists that made them essentially conservative and loyal to the king and Britain. They were older, better established, and resisted radical change. They felt that rebellion against the crown, the legitimate government, was morally wrong. They were alienated when the Patriots resorted to violence, such as burning houses and tarring and feathering. They wanted to take a middle-of-the-road position and were angry when forced by the Patriots to declare their opposition. They had a long-standing sentimental attachment to Britain. They were procrastinators who realized that independence was bound to come someday, but wanted to postpone the moment. They were cautious and afraid that chaos and mob rule would result. Some were pessimists who lacked the confidence in the future displayed by the Patriots. Others recalled the dreadful experiences of many Jacobite rebels after the failure of the last Jacobite rebellion as recently as 1745, who often lost their lands when the Hanoverian government won. Other motivations of the Loyalists were, they felt a need for order and believed that Parliament was the legitimate authority. In New York, powerful families had assembled colony-wide coalitions of supporters. Men long associated with the Delancey faction went along when its leadership decided to support the crown. They felt themselves to be weak or threatened within American society and in need of an outside defender such as the British Crown and Parliament. They had been promised freedom from slavery by the British. They felt that being a part of the British Empire was crucial in terms of commerce and their business operations. Loyalism and military operations. In the opening months of the Revolutionary War, the Patriots laid siege to Boston, where most of the British forces were stationed. Elsewhere there were few British troops, and the Patriots seized control of all levels of government, as well as supplies of arms and gunpowder. These actions were not without resistance. Especially in New York, New Jersey, and parts of North and South Carolina, there was considerable ambivalence about the Patriot cause. Vocal Loyalists, often with the encouragement and assistance of royal governors, recruited people to their side. In the South Carolina backcountry, Loyalist recruitment outstripped that of Patriots. A brief siege at 96 in the fall of 1775 was followed by a rapid rise in Patriot recruiting and a snow campaign, major campaign involving thousands of partisan militia, resulted in the arrest or flight of most of the backcountry Loyalist leadership. By July 4, 1776, the Patriots had gained control of virtually all territory in the 13 colonies, and expelled all royal officials. No one who openly proclaimed their loyalty to the crown was allowed to remain, so for the moment, Loyalists fled or kept quiet. Some of those who remained later gave aid to invading British armies or joined uniformed Loyalist regiments. The British were forced out of Boston by March 17, 1776. They regrouped at Halifax and attacked New York in August, handing a convincing defeat to George Washington's army at Long Island and capturing New York City and its vicinity. The British forces would occupy the area around the mouth of the Hudson River until 1783. British forces would also seize control of other cities, including Philadelphia, Savannah and Charleston, as well as various slices of countryside. But 90% of the colonial population lived outside the cities, with the effective result being that the Congress controlled 80 to 90% of the population. The British removed their governors from colonies where the Patriots were in control, but Loyalist civilian government was re-established in coastal Georgia from 1779 to 1782. Despite presence of Patriot forces in the northern part of Georgia, essentially, the British were only able to maintain power in areas where they had a strong military presence. Numbers of Loyalists. Historian Robert Calhoun wrote in 2000, concerning the proportion of Loyalists to Patriots in the 13 colonies. Historians' best estimates put the proportion of adult white male Loyalists somewhere between 15 and 20%. Approximately half the colonists of European ancestry tried to avoid involvement in the struggle, some of them deliberate pacifists, others recent immigrants, and many more simple apolitical folk. The Patriots received active support from perhaps 40 to 45% of the white populace, and at most no more than a bare majority. Before Calhoun's work, estimates of the Loyalist share of the population were somewhat higher, at about one-third, but these estimates are now seen as too high by most scholars. Adams did indeed estimate in another letter of that year that in the American Revolution, the Patriots had to struggle against approximately one-third of the population, while they themselves constituted about two-thirds of it. He did not mention neutrals. In 1968, historian Paul H. Smith estimated there were about 500,000 Loyalists, or 16% of the white population. Historian Robert Middlecalf summarized scholarly research on the nature of Loyalist support as follows. The largest number of Loyalists were found in the Middle Colonies. Many tenant farmers of New York supported the king, for example, as did many of the Dutch in the colony and in New Jersey. The Germans in Pennsylvania tried to stay out of the Revolution, just as many Quakers did, and when that failed, clung to the familiar connection rather than embrace the new. Highland Scots in the Carolinas, a fair number of Anglican clergy and the parishioners in Connecticut and New York, a few Presbyterians in the southern colonies, and a large number of the Iroquois Indians stayed loyal to the king. New York City and Long Island were the British military and political base of operations in North America from 1776 to 1783 and had a large concentration of Loyalists, many of whom were refugees from other states. According to Calhoun, Loyalists tended to be older and wealthier, but there were also many Loyalists of humble means. Many active Church of England members became Loyalists. Some recent arrivals from Britain, especially those from Scotland, had a high Loyalist proportion. Loyalists in the southern colonies were suppressed by the local Patriots, who controlled local and state government. Many people, including former regulators in North Carolina, refused to join the rebellion, as they had earlier protested against corruption by local authorities who later became revolutionary leaders. The oppression by the local Whigs during the regulation led to many of the residents of backcountry North Carolina sitting out the revolution or siding with the Loyalists. In areas under Patriot control, Loyalists were subject to confiscation of property, and outspoken supporters of the king were threatened with public humiliation such as tarring and feathering, or physical attack. It is not known how many Loyalist civilians were harassed by the Patriots, but the treatment was a warning to other Loyalists not to take up arms. In September 1775, William Drayton and Loyalist leader Colonel Thomas Fletchall signed a treaty of neutrality in the interior community of 96, South Carolina, for actively aiding the British Army when it occupied Philadelphia. 2 residents of the city were tried for treason, convicted, and executed by returning Patriot forces. Slavery and black Loyalists. As a result of the looming crisis in 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord John Moore, issued a proclamation that promised freedom to servants and slaves who were able to bear arms and join his Loyalist Ethiopian regiment. Many of the slaves in the South joined the Loyalists with intentions of gaining freedom and escaping the South. About 800 did so. Some helped rout the Virginia militia at the Battle of Kemp's Landing and fought in the Battle of Great Bridge on the Elizabeth River, wearing the motto, "Liberty to Slaves," but this time they were defeated. The remains of their regiment were then involved in the evacuation of Norfolk, after which they served in the Chesapeake area. Eventually the camp that they had set up there suffered an outbreak of smallpox and other diseases. This took a heavy toll, putting many of them out of action for some time. There was a slave by the name of Boston King who joined the Loyalists and wound up catching smallpox. Boston King and other soldiers who were sick were relocated to a different part of the camp so that they did not contaminate the healthy soldiers. The survivors joined other British units and continued to serve throughout the war. Black colonials were often the first to come forward to volunteer, and a total of 12,000 African Americans served with the British from 1775 to 1783. This factor had the effect of forcing the rebels to also offer freedom to those who would serve in the Continental Army. However, such promises were often reneged upon by both sides. African Americans who gained their freedom by fighting for the British became known as Black Loyalists. The British honored the Pledge of Freedom in New York through the efforts of General Guy Carleton, who recorded the names of African Americans who had supported the British in a document called the Book of Negroes, which granted freedom to slaves who had escaped and assisted the British. About 4,000 black Loyalists went to the British colonies of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where the British promised them land. They founded communities across the 2 provinces, many of which still exist today. Over 2,500 settled in Birchtown, Nova Scotia, instantly making it the largest free black community in North America. However, the inferior grants of land they were given and the prejudices of white Loyalists in nearby Shelburne who regularly harassed the settlement in events such as the Shelburne riots in 1784, made life very difficult for the community. In 1791, Britain's Sierra Leone Company offered to transport dissatisfied black Loyalists to the British colony of Sierra Leone in Africa, with the promise of better land and more equality. About 1,200 left Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone, where they named the capital Freetown. After 1787 they became Sierra Leone's ruling elite. About 400 to 1,000 free blacks who joined the British side in the Revolution went to London and joined the free black community of about 10,000 there. Loyalism in Canada. Rebel agents were active in Quebec in the months leading to the outbreak of active hostilities. John Brown, an agent of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, worked with Canadian merchant Thomas Walker and other rebel sympathizers during the winter of 1774 to 1775 to convince inhabitants to support the actions of the First Continental Congress. However, many of Quebec's inhabitants remained neutral, resisting service to either the British or the Americans. Although some Canadians took up arms in support of the rebellion, the majority remained loyal to the king. French Canadians had been satisfied by the British government's Quebec Act of 1774, which offered religious and linguistic toleration. In general, they did not sympathize with a rebellion that they saw as being led by Protestants from New England, who were their commercial rivals and hereditary enemies. Most of the English-speaking settlers had arrived following the British conquest of Canada in 1759 to 1760. And unlikely to support separation from Britain. The older British colonies, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, which at the time included present-day New Brunswick, also remained loyal to the Crown and contributed military forces in support of the Crown. In late 1775, the Continental Army sent a force into Quebec, led by General Richard Montgomery and Colonel Benedict Arnold, with the goal of convincing the residents of Quebec to join the Revolution. Although only a minority of Canadians openly expressed loyalty to King George, about 1,500 militia fought for the king in the siege of Fort St. John, in the region south of Montreal that was occupied by the Continentals. Some inhabitants supported the rebellion and raised 2 regiments to join the Patriot forces. In Nova Scotia, there were many Yankee settlers originally from New England, and they generally supported the principles of the Revolution. This element was declining in relative numbers and influence due to an influx of recent immigration from the British Isles, and they remained neutral during the war, and the influx was greatest in Halifax. Britain in any case built up powerful forces at the naval base of Halifax after the failure of Jonathan Eddy to capture Fort Cumberland in 1776. Although the Continentals captured Montreal in November 1775, they were turned back a month later at Quebec City by a combination of the British military under Governor Guy Carleton, the difficult terrain and weather, and an indifferent local response. The Continental forces would be driven from Quebec in 1776, after the breakup of ice on the St. Lawrence River and the arrival of British transports in May and June. There would be no further serious attempt to challenge British control of present-day Canada until the War of 1812. In 1777, 1,500 Loyalist militia took part in a British expedition that eventually led to the surrender of Burgoyne after the battles of Saratoga in northern New York. After the entry of France into the war in 1778, many English-speaking settlers with Loyalist sympathies feared that the French would attempt to reclaim their former colony on the St. Lawrence, which solidified their support for the British Crown. For the rest of the war, Quebec acted as a base for raiding expeditions, conducted primarily by Loyalists and Indians, against frontier communities. During peace negotiations in Paris, negotiators from the United States made repeated attempts to acquire territory in what is now Canada, the territory that became known as the Northwest Territory, which included the British posts at Detroit and Mackinac, but was mostly Indian territory administered as part of the province of Quebec, became part of the United States. Present-day Michigan would not come under American control until 1796. Military service. The Loyalists rarely attempted any political organization. They were often passive unless regular British Army units were in the area. The British, however, assumed a highly activist Loyalist community was ready to mobilize and planned much of their strategy around raising Loyalist regiments. The British Provincial line, consisting of Americans enlisted on a regular army status, enrolled 19,000 Loyalists. The maximum strength of the Loyalist Provincial line was 9,700 in December 1780. In all, about 19,000 at one time or another were soldiers or militia in British forces. Loyalists from South Carolina fought for the British in the Battle of Camden. The British forces at the Battle of Monk's Corner and the Battle of Leonard's Ferry consisted entirely of Loyalists with the exception of the commanding officer. Both white and black Loyalists fought for the British at the Battle of Kemp's Landing in Virginia.